Hey there, 511. This is Dr. Keisler, and this week we're going to be discussing variables and hypotheses. So, hopefully, you've already read the chapter in your Frankel, Wallen, and Hune text on variables and hypotheses. We're going to spend just a little bit of time here going over some of the different types of variables and talking a little bit about the role of hypotheses in our research and in relation to our research questions. So I clipped this photo right out of your chapter because I think it really exemplifies how many different variables are out there to consider when you're thinking about your research question, when you're thinking about studying a population, when you're thinking about doing research in general. So there's tons of different variables that can be identified amongst groups and amongst people, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the role that they play in your research. Your chapter spends a little bit of time talking about the importance of studying relationships. So when we're talking about variables, whether they be dependent variables or independent variables or moderator variables or mediator variables, all the different types of variables they discussed in the chapter. The point of the variables is that you're studying relationships, right? So scientists value research that investigates relationships more highly than purely descriptive research. And so the reason for this is that if you think back to chapter 2, or you even think back to some of the questions that you have formulated in your question exploration, you're thinking about questions that answer kind of how or what or does, and those tend to imply that the research is going to be descriptive. So while descriptive research is important, the thing that descriptive research does not do for us is it does not really tell us why, right? It doesn't really help us to understand kind of why a phenomenon is happening or why people or things are behaving in a certain way, right? Why certain characteristics belong to certain groups, whatever it is. It doesn't really give us that information about why, it just tells us that it is. So this chapter kind of focuses on getting towards the relationship piece, so getting closer to the why. So what is a variable, right? A variable is essentially, it's a concept. It's a noun that stands for a variation within a class of objects. So an example of this could be eye color. A constant is a characteristic with no variations within a class of objects. So, for example, the grade level of ninth graders, right? So, within a group, you could have a variable such as eye color because within that group of students that you were studying, you could have brown eyes and you could have blue eyes and you could have green eyes and you could have hazel eyes. But a constant would be one of those characteristics where there's no variation. So the example they give here, the grade level of ninth graders, right? Ninth graders are always going to be in the ninth grade. You could do a variable such as the age of ninth graders because you could have different ages within the ninth grade, but the grade level of ninth graders is not going to change. When designing a study or thinking about their research questions, researchers choose certain variables to study since they suspect that those variables are related to whatever the question, issue, or problem is that they want to explore. So they select the variables because they think that those particular things might be what's making the difference in the group that they would like to study, or might be the thing that is different, right? So then within the concept of the term of variable, we have several different types of variables. So the kind of big way to think about them, or a large umbrella, is this quantitative versus a categorical variable. Variables are classified as either one of those two. They're either quantitative or they're categorical. A quantitative variable is conceptualized and analyzed in distinct categories with no continuum applied. So this is kind of right from your textbook. So it can be divided into smaller units. A quantitative variable is naturally measured as a number for which applying some kind of statistic or mathematical arithmetic operation would make sense. So the example that they give here would be height. You could look at age. You could look at salary. You could look at temperature. Really anything that you could apply a number to, as quantitative implies, right? That is your quantitative variable. Whereas a categorical variable doesn't vary kind of in that number, kind of in the degree, the amount, or the quantity, but rather in the quality. So think about kind of that opposite of quantitative as the qualitative. Kind of means that there's no middle ground or no in between measurements. So really any variable that's not quantitative is considered categorical. Categorical variables take a value that's kind of one of several possible categories. So as you could measure it, categorical variables have no numerical or arithmetic meaning or association. So an example of those could be hair color, gender, the colleges that you attend, the program within that college that you participate in. They give you the example here of political party or political affiliation. So those aren't necessarily attached to a particular number. Sometimes it can get a little bit tricky because categorical variables can be disguised as quantitative variables when researchers are talking about their data. So, for example, you could, in your study, record gender information with a code. So, for example, 0 is male, 1 is female, or the number 1 equals male, or the number 2 equals female. And the reason for this is just that generally the data is easier to manipulate on a spreadsheet when it's coded quantitatively. But since those numbers, the 0 or the 1 or the 1 or the 2, are not a natural way to measure or quantify or qualify whether something is male or female, it's still a categorical variable. It doesn't become a quantitative variable just because you've assigned a number to it for coding purposes. So kind of just keep in mind that your categorical variables are groups, right? So gender could be an example of that. Your quantitative variable are numbers that have some kind of meaning or might have some kind of range, like somebody's weight in pounds, or the amount of baskets somebody makes in a basketball game. So sometimes for the purpose of analyzing data, we do turn the categorical variables into numbers, but it's really only for the purpose of identification. So if you think back to, if I had said a male, you might code the males as a 0 and the females as a 1. Those numbers don't mean anything in the sense that, being assigned a number 1 is better or higher than being assigned a 0, because those numbers aren't a way to measure male or female. It just is a way that we're coding or identifying it. So it's still categorical. If it was actually quantitative, you think about the number as meaning something. And so, with that quantitative data, having a higher number generally means you have more of something, and higher values have meaning. So if you're just coding, those values don't have any meaning. All right, so they also talk about, or you also need to consider, this idea of independent versus dependent variables. So the independent variable is what the researcher studies to see its relationship or its effects, right? It's that thing that they choose because it is their presumed or possible cause. Whereas your dependent variable is what is being influenced or affected by that independent variable. So it's the presumed result. So if you think about it on kind of a cause and effect continuum, your independent variable is potentially your cause, and your dependent variable is the result, or what you're trying to see, what's being influenced or affected by that independent variable. So they talk about some different types of independent and dependent variables, and the terminology changes kind of depending on which field of study you're thinking about these variables in. But you might hear terms or have read terms like experimental, manipulated, treatment, the grouping. These are all independent variables, right? So that factor that's measured is your independent variable. So whatever it is that you can manipulate, or the researcher can select to determine its relationship to the observed phenomena, that's your independent variable. In a research study, independent variables are the antecedent conditions that are presumed to have that effect on your dependent variable. They can be manipulated by the researcher. They can also be observed by the researcher, so that their values are related to that dependent variable. Another thing to remember about independent variables is that, you know, within that area of manipulation that the researcher takes with the independent variable, an independent variable can also be a classification. So if you are comparing two groups, the researcher putting the subjects or the participants into the groups, that group then becomes, that classification of the groups then becomes an independent variable, right? So then your dependent variable is really just that thing, that factor that the researcher is observing and measuring to see what the effect of the independent variable is on it, right? So they presume that independent variable has some effect on their dependent variable, and so they try to measure or they try to observe that. Your dependent variable is essentially just the outcome. So if you think about it in terms of an experiment, it may be what was caused or what was changed as a result of the study. So as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable, what was the outcome? What was the thing that was changed, or what was the result? If you were thinking back to that idea that I just mentioned about the comparison of groups, it would be what they differ on.